All right, welcome to the deep dive. We're all about turning information overload into, well, instant expertise, right?
That's right. You give us the sources, we do the heavy lifting, and extract all the key knowledge.
Exactly. And today we're diving into a pretty dense topic. It's the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea,
The COLREGs, as they're known.
the COLREGs. You guys sent us a whole bunch of excerpts from these rules. So basically, our mission is to kind of break it down, make it clear.
Yeah, make sure you understand the key principles of maritime navigation. The rules of the road, but at sea.
Yeah, rules of the road at sea, exactly. So let's just jump right in. Rule 1, application. Sounds kind of serious. So these aren't just like suggestions.
No,
Okay.
definitely not suggestions. Rule 1A is pretty clear. These rules apply to, well, it says, all vessels upon the high seas and in all waters connected therewith, navigable by seagoing vessels.
Okay, so if your boat could theoretically make it out to the ocean, you got to know these rules. Okay, pretty straightforward. But I see there are some exceptions, like, if you're just in a harbor or something.
Right. Rule 1B says that local authorities can make special rules for places like roadsteads, harbors, rivers, lakes, inland waterways, that sort of thing.
So like a roadstead, that's kind of like a...
That's like a sheltered area where ships can anchor. Less protected than a harbor, but easier to access.
Got it, like a waiting area for ships.
Exactly.
Mm.
And those special local rules, they still have to conform as closely as possible to the COLREGs. So there's still a kind of international standard, even with those variations.
Okay, so local tweaks are okay, but the COLREGs are like the foundation. Now, what about warships or like big fishing fleets? Do they have to follow the same rules?
Rule 1C addresses that. Governments can actually make special rules for things like additional lights, shapes, or even whistle signals for warships, vessels in a convoy, and fishing fleets that are working together. The rule stresses that these additions should not be mistaken for any other signals authorized by the COLREGs.
Right, you don't want to cause more confusion. And speaking of whistles, what exactly counts as a whistle according to these rules?
Good point. Rule 1 clarifies that a whistle means any sound signaling appliance that can produce the prescribed blasts. There's some technical standards involved, of course.
Okay, so not just any old whistle will do. Now, I've always been fascinated by those highways at sea, those designated lanes for ships.
You're talking about traffic separation schemes, or TSS, Rule 1D mentions those?
Yeah. They're basically like highways, but for ships. Designated lanes and separation zones to keep things organized and prevent head-on collisions, especially in high-traffic areas like straits. Rule 10 goes into detail on how to use them.
Okay, so Rule 10 is all about navigating those sea highways. We'll definitely have to dive into that one. Now, the last part of Rule 1 talks about vessels with special construction or purpose. What's that all about? Right, Rule 1E. Yeah. This basically recognizes that some vessels, like submarines or those massive aircraft carriers, because of their design, they might not be able to fully comply with all the rules about lights and shapes.
Yeah, I can see how an aircraft carrier might have some trouble with that.
Exactly. So in those cases, the government of that vessel figures out how to comply as closely as possible. The key is to adhere to the intent of the rules, even if the actual implementation is slightly different.
Right, adapt, but don't just ignore the rules. And Rule 1 also reminds us that a vessel can be pretty much anything that floats, right?
Pretty much. It includes everything from your typical ship to, non-displacement craft, wing and ground craft, even seaplanes when they're on the water. It's a broad definition.
All right, so that's a good overview of who these rules apply to and where there might be some flexibility. Now, you mentioned Rule 10 and those traffic separation schemes, those sea highways. Let's dive into those. What are the main things you need to know when you're navigating in one?
Okay, so Rule 10 gets pretty specific about conduct in a TSS. The first thing is you should be traveling in the appropriate traffic lane, going in the general direction of the traffic flow for that lane. That's Rule 10B.
Okay, so stay in your lane and go with the flow.
Exactly. Rule 10B2 also says to stay clear of those separation lines or separation zones between the lanes as much as possible. And when you're joining or leaving a lane, Rule 10B3 says you should do it at the end of the lane, if possible, and at a small angle to the general direction of traffic, just like merging onto a highway.
Makes sense. Enter and exit smoothly. Now, what if you absolutely have to cross one of these lanes?
Rule 10C says you should try to avoid crossing lanes, if at all possible. But if you have to, you need to cross on a heading that's as close to a right angle as possible to the general direction of the traffic flow.
So basically get across as quickly and safely as you can.
Exactly. minimize the disruption to the flow of traffic.
Now, what about those inshore traffic zones? I've seen those marked on charts. They run kind of alongside the main lanes. Who can use those?
Rule 10D covers that. Generally, you shouldn't use an inshore traffic zone if you can safely use the adjacent traffic lane in the main TSS. But there are some exceptions. Smaller vessels, less than 20 meters long, sailing vessels, and vessels fishing, they're allowed to use them.
Okay, so those zones are kind of like the access roads for smaller boats or those with a specific reason to be there.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
And Rule 10D also allows any vessel to use an inshore traffic zone if they're going to or from a port, an offshore installation, a pilot station, or anywhere within that zone, really. Or if they need to use it to avoid immediate danger.
Right, so it's flexible if you have a legitimate reason. Now, what about those separation zones between the lanes? Can you just cross over those whenever you want?
Nope, Rule 10E is pretty clear about that. You can't enter a separation zone or cross a separation line unless it's an emergency, to avoid immediate danger, or if you're fishing and you're already within a separation zone. Other than that, they're off limits. They're there to keep those lanes separated for safety.
Okay, so those lines are serious business. Rule 10 also talks about navigating near the ends of these TSS schemes and about anchoring. Any special rules there?
Yes. Rule 10 basically says to be extra careful when you're near the ends of these schemes. Traffic patterns can get a little unpredictable in those areas.
Right, where lanes are merging or splitting.
Exactly. And regarding anchoring, Rule 10G says you should avoid anchoring within a traffic separation scheme or near its terminations if you can. It's just common sense. You don't want to create an obstacle for other vessels.
Yeah, that would be like parking on the highway. Not a good idea. Now, what if you're not even using a TSS? Do you still have any responsibilities?
Definitely. Rule 10.8 says if you're not using a traffic separation scheme, you need to avoid it altogether by as wide a margin as you can. Don't get in the way of the traffic that is using the scheme.
Steer clear, stay out of the way. Now, we've mentioned fishing vessels a few times in relation to these TSS. What are their specific responsibilities?
Rule 10I says fishing vessels shouldn't impede the passage of any vessel following a traffic lane. Basically, their fishing activities shouldn't mess up the flow of traffic.
Okay, so be mindful of the bigger vessels using the lanes. And you mentioned earlier that vessel engaged in fishing has a specific meaning.
Right. It means a vessel using nets, lines, trawls, or other fishing gear that restricts maneuverability. It doesn't include just trolling lines.
Got it. It's about how the fishing gear affects the vessel's ability to maneuver. Finally, Rule 10 has some exemptions for vessels that have limited maneuverability. Can you explain those?
Sure. Rule 10K and L allow some flexibility for vessels that are restricted in their ability to maneuver, but only in specific situations. For example, if they're doing work to maintain safety of navigation within a TSS, or if they're laying, servicing, or picking up submarine cables within a TSS. In those cases, they might not be able to follow all the TSS rules exactly.
So basically, sometimes they have to bend the rules a little to do their job safely.
Exactly. And just to clarify, a vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver is one that, because of the nature of her work, can't maneuver as easily as other vessels.
Yeah.
This could be a vessel laying cables, dredging, refueling at sea, launching or recovering aircraft, doing mine clearance, or even towing something that severely restricts their ability to turn.
Okay, so lots of different scenarios where a vessel might have limited maneuverability. It's important for other vessels to be aware of that and give them some extra space.
Exactly.
Now, that's a pretty good overview of how these traffic separation schemes work, those sea highways. Let's switch gears a bit and talk about how different types of vessels interact with each other. Rule 12 is all about sailing vessels. What are the basic rules there?
Okay, so Rule 12 focuses on the right-of-way rules between two sailing vessels approaching each other. But first, it's important to remember the general rule. Power-driven vessels must give way to sailing vessels when the sailing vessel is under sail. Now, there are some exceptions to this general rule, depending on the type of power-driven vessel, but that's the basic idea.
Right, sailboats generally have the right of way over motorboats.
Exactly. But there's a big caveat. If a sailing vessel is using its engine, it's considered a power-driven vessel, even if the sails are up.
So even if they're motor sailing, they're considered a powerboat.
Right. And they should display a cone shape, apex downwards, forward of the mast to show this. Basically, if you're using your engine, you play by the powerboat rules.
Okay, engine on means powerboat rules apply. Now, when it comes to two sailboats approaching each other, how do they figure out who has to give way?
Rule 12A breaks down the different scenarios. If two sailing vessels are approaching, and the wind is on opposite sides, the vessel with the wind on the port, left side, has to give way to the vessel with the wind on the starboard right side.
Okay, port gives way to starboard. What if they both have the wind on the same side?
Then it gets a little trickier. Rule 12A2 says that when the wind is on the same side, the vessel that's closer to the windward vessel, has to give way to the vessel that's downwind, the leeward vessel.
Okay, so the windward vessel gives way to the leeward vessel. Makes sense. The windward one is probably more maneuverable.
Right. And then there's a situation where a port tack vessel can't tell which side the wind is on for the other vessel. Rule 12A3 says in that case, the port tack vessel has to give way.
So if you're on port tack and unsure, give way. Got it. And how do you determine which side is the windward side exactly?
Rule 12B defines that. For a vessel with a mainsail, it's the side opposite to where the mainsail is carried. For a square-rigged vessel, it's the side opposite to where the largest fore and aft sail is carried. It's all about which way the sails are filled by the wind.
Okay, makes sense. Let's move on to overtaking. Rule 13 seems pretty simple. If you're overtaking, you stay out of the way, but I'm sure there's more to it.
You're right. Rule 13A does say that the overtaking vessel has to keep out of the way of the vessel being overtaken. But the key is defining what exactly overtaking means in this context.
Right, when are you officially overtaking?
Rule 13B says you're overtaking when you're coming up on another vessel for more than 22.5 degrees abaft her beam. So imagine a line going straight out from the side of the vessel, that's her beam. 22.5 degrees abaft, that is pretty far back.
So if you're coming up on another vessel from that angle, you're the overtaking vessel.
Right. And at night, this means you would only be able to see the stern light of the vessel ahead, not her side lights.
Okay, so if you can only see the other vessel's rear light, you're probably overtaking. What if you're not sure?
Rule 13C says, when in doubt, assume you're overtaking. Always better to err on the side of caution.
Makes sense. And once you've started overtaking, what if the angle changes between the two vessels? Does that change anything?
Not really. Rule 13C says even if the bearing changes, you're still considered the overtaking vessel, and you still have to keep clear until you're completely past and clear of the other vessel.
So once you're overtaking until you're fully past. All right, overtaking is clear. What about head-on situations? That's Rule 14, right?
Yep. Rule 14A deals with two power-driven vessels meeting head-on or nearly head-on. It says both vessels should alter course to starboard, to the right, so that they pass each other on their port sides.
So both boats steer right. How do you know for sure you're in a head-on situation?
Rule 14B describes how to recognize it. During the day, you'd see the other vessel straight ahead, showing its bow. At night, you'd see their masthead lights in line, or nearly in line, and both of their side lights. That's how you know you're looking at the front of the vessel and it's coming right at you.
So white masthead lights lined up with the red and green side lights, that's a head-on situation. And what if you're not totally sure?
Just like with overtaking, Rule 14C says, if you're in doubt, assume it's a head-on situation and steer to starboard.
Better safe than sorry. All right, next up is Rule 15, crossing situations. This is when two power-driven vessels are approaching each other at an angle. Who has to give way then?
Rule 15 says the vessel that has the other vessel on her own starboard side has to give way. So basically, if the other vessel is coming from your right, you have to get out of the way.
Okay, starboard has the right of way. And the rule also suggests avoiding crossing in front of the other vessel if possible, right?
That's right. It's generally safer to pass behind the other vessel.
Now, we've mentioned Rule 16 a few times, the action by the giveaway vessel. What exactly does that mean they have to do?
Rule 16 is pretty clear. Take early and substantial action to keep well clear. Don't wait until the last minute to make a small turn. You need to act decisively and early to let the other vessel know what you're doing.
Okay, decisive action early. Got it. That brings us to Rule 17, the action by the stand-on vessel. That's the vessel that doesn't have to give way initially. What are their responsibilities?
Well, Rule 17, AI, says the stand-on vessel should maintain her course and speed. That allows the giveaway vessel to predict the stand-on vessel's movement and maneuver accordingly.
Right. Don't make any sudden moves that could confuse the other vessel.
Exactly. But Rule 17A2 also says that the stand-on vessel can take action to avoid a collision if it becomes clear that the giveaway vessel isn't taking appropriate action. They can't just sit there and let a collision happen.
So they hold their course and speed unless it becomes clear the other vessel is messing up. And what if a collision is going to happen no matter what the giveaway vessel does?
In that case, Rule 17B says the stand-on vessel has to take whatever action will best help avoid a collision. This might mean altering course or speed, even though they're supposed to maintain course and speed initially. At that point, avoiding the accident is the priority.
Right, safety first. And if the stand-on vessel does have to maneuver, is there any guidance on which way they should turn?
Yes, Rule 17C says a power-driven stand-on vessel should generally avoid turning to port for a vessel on her own port side, if possible. This is to prevent both vessels from turning the same way and potentially colliding.
Okay, so don't turn towards the other vessel. And Rule 17 ends by reminding us that the giveaway vessel is still ultimately responsible, right?
Exactly. Rule 17D is very clear. This rule doesn't let the giveaway vessel off the hook. The stand-on vessel's actions are a last resort. The giveaway vessel always has the primary responsibility to avoid a collision.
Right, they can't just assume the stand-on vessel will get them out of trouble. Now, we've covered the basic right-of-way rules for different situations. Rule 18 seems to lay out a sort of hierarchy between different types of vessels. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Rule 18 is titled Responsibilities Between Vessels, and it basically establishes a pecking order of who should generally give way to whom. The main thing to remember is that in most situations, a power-driven vessel underway has to give way to several other types of vessels.
Okay, so powerboats have to be extra careful around certain other vessels. What are those?
Well, first on the list is a vessel not under command. That's a vessel that, for some exceptional reason, can't maneuver as required by the rules and therefore can't keep out of the way of another vessel.
So a vessel that's basically disabled.
Right. Next is a vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver, like the ones we talked about earlier that might be laying cables or dredging. They can't maneuver easily, so other vessels have to give them space. Then we have vessels engaged in fishing when their maneuverability is limited by their gear.
Right, because their nets or lines might make it hard to turn quickly.
Exactly. And finally, power-driven vessels have to give way to sailing vessels under sail.
So the general rule is power gives way to sail.
Right. But keep in mind that this hierarchy only applies when rules 9, 10, and 13 don't say otherwise. Those rules about narrow channels, traffic separation schemes, and overtaking take precedence.
Okay, so this hierarchy is the default rule, unless those other specific rules apply. Now, what about sailing vessels themselves? Who do they have to give way to?
Rule 18b says that a sailing vessel underway has to keep out of the way of vessels not under command, vessels restricted in their ability to maneuver, and vessels engaged in fishing.
So even though they have the right of way over powerboats, they still have to give way to those less maneuverable vessels.
Right. It's all about relative maneuverability.
And what about fishing vessels underway?
Rule 18c says they have to keep out of the way of vessels not under command and vessels restricted in their ability to maneuver. So the same idea.
Yeah.
Those with more limitations get priority.
Okay, makes sense. Now, there's also mention of a vessel constrained by her draft. Where does that fit into this hierarchy?
Rule 18d addresses that. It says any vessel except one not under command or restricted in her ability to maneuver should avoid getting in the way of a vessel constrained by her draft, if possible.
What exactly does constrained by her draft mean?
It means it's a power-driven vessel that, because it's so deep in the water, has a hard time changing course. They're usually big, deep draft ships that need a lot of water under their keel,
Yeah.
and they'll be displaying special signals as per Rule 28, like 3 all-round red lights in a vertical line or a cylinder shape.
Okay, so basically, give those big ships extra space, especially in shallow water. Exactly. Rule 18d also says that vessels constrained by their draft have to navigate with particular caution because of their limited maneuverability.
Right, they can't just turn on a dime. Now, Rule 18 also talks about seaplanes and those wing-in-ground craft, the ones that fly close to the surface. What are the rules regarding them?
Well, Rule 18e says seaplanes on the water should generally stay well clear of all vessels and not get in the way. But it does acknowledge that sometimes there might be a risk of collision.
Right, they can't always just fly over everything.
Exactly. And for wing-in-ground craft, or WIG craft, Rule 18 says they have to stay well clear of all other vessels when they're taking off, landing, or flying close to the surface. But when they're operating on the water, they have to follow the COLREGs just like any other power-driven vessel.
Okay, so there are planes in the air, boats on the water. That covers a lot about how vessels interact in good visibility. What about when visibility is reduced, like in fog? Rule 19 deals with that, right? Yes. Rule 19 is all about conduct in restricted visibility, which means any condition where visibility is reduced, like fog, mist, falling snow, heavy rain, sandstorms, you name it.
Right. Any condition where it's hard to see, what's the most important rule in those situations?
The most important rule is to slow down. Rule 19b says every vessel has to proceed at a safe speed adapted to the conditions. And for power-driven vessels, this means having your engines ready for immediate maneuver.
Okay, so slow down and be ready to take action. What if you detect another vessel on radar, but you can't see them?
Rule 19 says if you detect another vessel by radar alone, you have to determine if a close-quarters situation is developing or if there's a risk of collision. If so, you need to take avoiding action in ample time. The rule also gives specific advice about avoiding certain course alterations that could make the situation worse.
Right, you don't want to turn into the path of an unseen vessel. What if you hear a fog signal, but you still can't see the other vessel? Or you're in a close quarters situation that you can't avoid?
Rule 19E is clear about that. You have to slow down to the minimum speed at which you can still maintain your course. If necessary, you should stop completely. And in any case, you have to navigate with extreme caution until the danger's over.
Okay, so when in doubt, slow way down and proceed very carefully. Now, we've talked a lot about specific rules. Rule 2 seems to be more about general responsibility. What's the main message there?
Rule 2 is titled Responsibility, and it's super important. Rule 2A says that even if you follow all the rules, it doesn't excuse you from the consequences of neglecting any precaution required by good seamanship or by the special circumstances of the case.
So the rules are a starting point, not the end of the story. You still need to use common sense and good judgment.
Exactly. And Rule 2B reinforces that by saying you have to consider all the dangers of navigation and collision, as well as any special circumstances that might require you to deviate from the rules to avoid danger.
Right, sometimes you have to bend the rules to stay safe. Now let's jump into Part C of the COLREGs. This is all about lights and shapes, the visual signals that vessels use to communicate with each other. Rule 20 is kind of the intro to this section, right?
Yep, Rule 20 lays out the basic application rules for lights and shapes. Rule 20A says these rules apply in all weathers, so no matter what the conditions are, you have to comply with the lighting and shape requirements.
Okay, so no excuses about rain or fog.
Right. Rule 20B then says the rules concerning lights are in effect from sunset to sunrise, and during that time you can't display any other lights that could be mistaken for the prescribed lights, or that would make it harder to see the prescribed lights, or interfere with keeping a proper lookout.
Right, so no Christmas lights on your boat at night.
Pretty much. But Rule 20C also says you can exhibit those prescribed lights during the day if visibility is restricted, or any other time it's necessary for safety.
Okay, so lights at night and in low visibility. What about shapes?
Rule 20D says those are for daytime use. And lastly, Rule 20E says all lights and shapes have to meet the technical standards laid out in Annex C of the regulations.
So they have to be the right type of lights and shapes, and they have to be working properly.
Got it. Now, Rule 21 gives us the definitions of all these different lights, right?
Exactly. It defines all those key terms that we're going to see throughout this section. A masthead light is a white light placed over the fore and aft center line of the vessel, showing an unbroken light over an arc of 225 degrees ahead. Side lights are a green light on the starboard side and a red light on the port side, each showing over 112.5 degrees from right ahead to just abaft the beam. A stern light shows a white light from the stern over an arc of 135 degrees. A towing light is a yellow light that looks just like a stern light. An all-round light shows unbroken light over 360 degrees. And finally, a flashing light flashes at a regular frequency of 120 flashes a minute or more.
Wow, that's a lot of lights. It's like a whole language of lights. It is. It's important for vessels to be able to understand each other's signals, especially at night or in low visibility.
Absolutely. Now, Rule 22 talks about how far these lights need to be visible. That probably depends on the size of the boat, right?
You're right. Rule 22 gives the minimum visibility ranges for each light, and it does vary depending on the vessel's length. For example, for a vessel 50 meters or more in length, the masthead light has to be visible for 6 miles. Side lights and stern lights have to be visible for 3 miles. And an all-round light also has to be visible for 3 miles. Those ranges decrease for smaller vessels.
Makes sense. Bigger boats need brighter lights that can be seen farther away. Now let's get into the specific lights that different types of vessels are required to display. Rule 23 covers power-driven vessels underway. What's the standard setup there?
Rule 23A says a power-driven vessel underway has to display one masthead light forward. If the vessel is 50 meters or more in length, it has to display a second masthead light aft and higher than the forward one. Smaller vessels can have 2 masthead lights, but it's not required.
Okay, so 1 or 2 masthead lights depending on size. What else?
They also have to display side lights, red and green, and a stern light, which is white.
So the classic red, green, and white lights we see on boats.
Exactly. Now, there are some special cases outlined in Rule 23. For example, air cushion vessels operating in non-displacement mode Those hovercraft, they have to show an all-round flashing yellow light in addition to the regular lights. And wig craft, those the ones that fly close to the surface, they show a high-intensity flashing red all-round light when they're taking off, landing, or flying near the surface, again, along with their standard lights.
Okay, so some extra lights for those special types of vessels.
Right. And finally, Rule 23 offers some alternative lighting arrangements for smaller power-driven vessels under 12 meters and for vessels under 7 meters that have a maximum speed of 7 knots or less.
So there's some flexibility for those smaller, slower boats. Now, Rule 24 gets into towing and pushing. That sounds like it could get complicated.
It does get a bit more complex. Rule 24A covers the lights for a power-driven vessel when it's towing another vessel. Instead of showing 1 or 2 masthead lights forward, it shows 2 masthead lights in a vertical line. If the length of the tow is longer than 200 meters, then it shows 3 masthead lights in a vertical line. It also shows the regular side lights and stern light, plus a yellow towing light in a vertical line above the stern light. And if the tow is longer than 200 meters, it also displays a diamond shape where it can be best seen.
Okay, so when you're towing, you basically have to double up on the masthead lights and add a towing light, and that diamond shape is like a warning sign for a long tow.
Exactly. Rule 24B then clarifies that when a pushing vessel and a vessel being pushed ahead are rigidly connected, forming a composite unit, they're considered one power-driven vessel and just display the normal power-driven vessel lights.
So it's like they become one big boat.
Right. But if the pushing vessel and the pushed vessel aren't rigidly connected, they have to follow a different set of rules outlined in Rule 24C. In that case, the pushing vessel shows 2 masthead lights in a vertical line, side lights, and a stern light.
Okay, so different lights for pushing alongside or pushing ahead. What about the vessel that's being towed?
Rule 24E says that a vessel or object being towed has to show side lights and a stern light. If the length of the tow exceeds 200 meters, it also has to show that diamond shape we talked about earlier. And there are additional provisions in Rule 24F and G for vessels being towed alongside or pushed in a group, and for inconspicuous or partly submerged tows.
Right, so the towed vessel still needs to be visible to other vessels. And what if it's just not possible to display all the required lights when towing?
Rule 24 addresses that. It basically says if it's really impractical to display all the lights, you just do the best you can.
Okay, so some flexibility in those unusual situations. And Rule 24I mentions something about assisting a vessel in distress.
Right. That provision basically says that vessels that aren't normally engaged in towing but find themselves assisting a vessel in distress are allowed to deviate from the normal towing light requirements if necessary.
Okay, so helping a vessel in distress takes priority over the strict letter of the law. Now let's move on to Rule 25. This one covers sailing vessels underway and vessels under oars. What kind of lights do they have to show?
Rule 25A is pretty straightforward. It says a sailing vessel underway has to show side lights, the red and green ones, and a stern light.
Same as a power.